All right, so this week we're going to talk about the triumph of conservatism and go through Presidents Nixon, Carter, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Ronald Reagan. Now, Richard Nixon. Unbeknownst to most, under Richard Nixon, the welfare state expanded. He had relations between the Soviets and China. Not to mention, he was the first guy to come up with what we consider to be Obamacare today. He was a man who first described or tried to implement or come up with a plan for health care for all Americans. Now, he was more of a foreign affair guy and moved to the center of the political sphere to not make anybody in Congress mad because Congress was still somewhat dominated by the Democrats. And he actually expanded much of what Lyndon Baines Johnson talked about with his Great Society. However, Nixon called it New Federalism. He created the EPA, he created OSHA, he expanded food stamps and Social Security as well. He signed the Clean Air Act and so on and so forth. So he's kind of one of these guys who kind of is known for being a crook and lying, but he actually did quite a bit. Has done a lot of things that are still very popular and worthwhile today. Now, originally, welfare, which was created in the New Deal with FDR, was to help poor whites. But by the 1970s, welfare had become associated with African Americans because half of African Americans in the 1970s had welfare in one way or another. And it really expands to all races by the 1960s because of unwed mothers. But what Nixon tries to do is to create a family assistance plan or a negative income tax, meaning each American would be able to make a minimum amount of money in order to either pay income taxes or get income taxes back. And if you didn't make a certain amount of money, then you would get money back from the government. However, Congress actually says no to this. So in a lot of ways, he's a forward-thinking progressive Republican, but he's not necessarily known for this, and things like the negative income tax don't come to fruition like he wanted. Now with race, it's a mixed bag. He nominated white Southern judges to the Supreme Court with records of supporting segregation. They were rejected by the Senate. But on the other hand, he really helped integrate universities and helped African Americans get into colleges because it went from 32% during the early 70s of all colleges allowed African Americans into 77% by the end of the 1970s with him. He also had a type of affirmative action which was called the Philadelphia Plan. And it was this idea for construction workers, for federal contractors to hire a certain amount of black workers. But skilled trade unions got really upset at this because there were no black workers in skilled trade unions. So unions saying, hey, you're hiring African Americans who may not be as skilled as people, and they're definitely not paying union fees, so you shouldn't be able to hire them. And so he backs down of this too. But it's still an open debate in today about reverse discrimination and this idea that what affirmative action and things like the Philadelphia Plan do they hire people who aren't as skilled because you have a certain quota, or are you allowing people of minorities who were not who were not even going to get those jobs earlier now have the chance to get them. And so Nixon is one of the first presidents who brings this to the forefront, this idea, um, which is affirmative action. During his time period, there's also the sexual revolution, and this really becomes mainstream. Divorce is sore during his presidency. Not that he had anything to do with that, but just talking about what's happening in the country while he's the president. Divorce is soared to almost 1 million. No, excuse me, more than 1 million divorces in 1975 alone, which was double just 10 years before. The marriage age goes up to 24 for males and 22 for women. Abortions and contraceptives meant choice. The birth rate declines dramatically to 1.7 per family in 1976. It was 3.4 in 1957, so almost 2 kids per family less in only 20 years, excuse me. In 1972, you also get Title IX, which allows working women, really helps with discrimination in work. Perhaps most importantly, or most maybe not importantly, but it's most popularly known. Title IX as allowing women to play college sports. So now we have women at just as many women college athletes as we do men college athletes, but it also has to do with getting women into college. You'll hear a lot of journalists and other highly educated CEO women today who say Title IX is the reason they are where they are today. If you're interested in this, that's a very interesting PowerPoint, Title IX. This is all going on during Nixon's as president, Nixon's time as president. Working women increased dramatically. Some sought careers while others needed to bolster their income. And so we call the term for that was called pink collar. Because they're not blue collar, they're not white collar, they're pink collar. I don't know if that's even necessarily the right thing to say today, but at the time, that's the idea. The basic idea is that women are starting to get into the workforce, and they're also starting to get educated, and they're also starting to be able to play college athletics. And so if you play college athletics, that means you're in college, right? And so the amount of women who go into college and universities skyrockets during this time period into today, when more women are in universities than men. He also was president during détente, which means a softening of relations between the Soviet Union and the Chinese. He disappointed many conservatives for being soft on communism. However, he did still do what most American presidents did before him, and that was funnel arms to dictators in Iran, in the Philippines, and South Africa. He did destabilize socialist rulers in South America, Salvador Allende in Chile, which the CIA actually killed in 1973, and he did back Pinochet until the United States did until the 1980s. And if you're looking for that Pinochet's, we don't have time to go into him, but he was a brutal, ruthless man, and you spell his name Pinochet. We backed him. Look him up. Nixon and him, his Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger, and they were realists. They were more about political power and geopolitics than ideology, and they really wanted to end the Vietnam War. So they thawed relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they really realized they are the men in the early 1970s, Kissinger and Nixon, who realized that China and the Soviet Union were not really friends anymore, even though they're neighbors and they're communists. Both of them thought that they were the head of the communist world revolution. And so China and the USSR actually didn't get along at all. And so Kissinger and Nixon were the first guys who really used this. So in 1971, Henry Kissinger secretly flies to China. No one knew. This is the first time a president had even remotely thought about going to China since it turned communist. Kissinger flies there secretly. He meets with the secretary of the Communist Party there, and then Nixon followed at the beginning of 1972 in February. And so what also follows Nixon is what we call ping pong diplomacy. And what Nixon does in 1972 is, because the Chinese loved ping pong, Nixon sends the United States ping pong team over to China. And it's kind of the first kind of quote unquote friendship move that the United States had made towards China. And it's just this really cool softening of rhetoric between the Chinese and the Americans, and it's done through ping pong. I believe that Forrest Gump goes to China when he plays ping pong really well in that movie. I believe. Don't quote me on that. It's been so long since I've seen Forrest Gump, but maybe I'll put a YouTube up about ping pong diplomacy, and it's just kind of this really cool geopolitical move to soften relations. So that's February 1972, or is when Nixon goes to China. Ping pong diplomacy was earlier in 1971. But after Kissinger goes to China, Nixon also goes to the USSR, and he's the first U.S. president to visit the USSR as well. And while he's there, they signed the SALT treaties, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, which meant that the USSR and the Soviet Union would no longer build intercontinental missiles to move warheads, and they would no longer build defenses so that they would not be tempted to use bombs without repercussions. So Nixon is really the first president who tries systematically and publicly to soften relations between communism and the capitalist democratic West. And it's not so much, Nixon's not so much interested in Kissinger in ideology, but rather things like politics and geopolitics and power and the idea of limiting weaponry. So let's talk a little bit about Nixon and Vietnam and Watergate. So he comes to the presidency and he wants to end the Vietnam War. And so what he does in 1970s is he calls it a Vietnamization. He came into office and he was going to end the war. And what Vietnamization was the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops while backing the South Vietnamese with America bombing and making sure that the South Vietnamese did more of the fighting. But this didn't limit the war, actually, or the protests. In fact, in 1970, the U.S. troops go into neutral Cambodia, right here, to cut off supply lines. But it actually destables Cambodia, and what actually comes out of this is the Khmer Rouge. If you're interested, look them up. Khmer Rouge, the Khmer Rouge. And because of this invasion into Cambodia, you also get Kent State. What happens is there's protests on Kent State and Jackson State University campuses, and actually 4 people get killed at the Kent State riot by police. They're killed by the National Guard, and 2 die in Mississippi at Jackson State. I think I put up a YouTube about this is Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's very famous Ohio, 4 Dead in Ohio. That's about this. Tin Soldiers and Nixon's Coming. More than 350 colleges in 1970 have some type of protest at them, mostly because of the U.S. invasion into Cambodia. National Guard troops had to occupy 21 campuses. And these aren't just elite schools, because both Kent State and Jackson State are working class. These are just, regular colleges that local people went to, and a lot of them were poor whites and African Americans. While this is happening, though, in the actual Vietnam War, morale lessens. The morale of the troops are going down. Um, um, because working class whites and racial minorities were dying at a high level. Those are the people who actually were going to war here, right? And that's the idea of why a lot of people were upset about this, is the fact that um, in order to get out of the war, you could go to college or this and that. And so the people who are fighting this war are working class people, and that's poor whites and racial minorities, and they're dying, and people aren't happy about this. Soldiers are doing drugs. They openly wore peace symbols on their uniforms while they were patrolling. There was Black Power following Malcolm X going on in Vietnam, in these in all kinds of units there. And people were starting to refuse orders. They were starting to assault unpopular officers, and thousands of people were deserting. And you also had at home veterans holding anti-war demonstrations. At home, it's when you start seeing this, and like we talked about last week, all of this stuff is on television, and we have this whole idea of what are we doing there now. And so by 1970, people are amped up, and this is one of the reasons why Nixon's trying to end the war. And in 1970, you also get the My Lai massacre, when a company of troops killed 350 civilians, and only one officer was found guilty of directing it. And people in America hear this, and all over the world, and they're just astonished by how poorly the war is going, and the morale, and bad things are happening on a daily basis. So in 1973, Congress passes 21 campus. Congress passes the War Power Act, which meant that the president could not go to war without Congress's approval. So now, because of Vietnam War, we have this law that says a president cannot declare war. It has to be okayed by Congress in order for the United States to go to war. A president can send troops in for 90 days, but then either they have to get out or Congress has to okay the war. But a president cannot declare war. And so this is going to start signaling the end of the war. In 1973, the United States negotiates a settlement at Paris. The draft comes to an end, and South Vietnam remains fighting until 1975. But in 1975, they launched their last offensive, and the North Vietnamese do not buckle, and the United States does not intervene except to get all Americans out of there by 1975. So Vietnam is the only war that the United States has ever lost, and it was a military, political, and social disaster. 58,000 men died, Americans died, along with probably 3 to 4 million Vietnamese. It cost $100 billion to fight the war, but probably most importantly is what it did is it undermined U.S. confidence in its own institutions. And so we really had to look back into ourselves and ask what we were about, right? 2 decades later, McNamara, who was a Secretary of State during some of this, wrote how terribly wrong it was with just the United States had a complete lack of knowledge of the history and the culture of the Vietnamese, and that really what what the USSR wanted to happen was the United States to get bogged down in a war there, and that's exactly what occurred, right? Robert McNamara said it was just a colossal you know what from the beginning for the United States. And we're still dealing with it today, and a lot of people, uh, it's still a sore subject for a lot of people. Um, so that's kind of what happens in 1973. But before this happens, in 1972, we had Watergate. So by the time the war ended, Richard Nixon actually wasn't president anymore. Um, Interestingly enough, so in 1972, he wins a landslide victory, especially in the South, but it soon turns to disaster because he was paranoid and obsessed with secrecy. And so what Nixon does is he develops a quote unquote enemies list of reporters, politicians, celebrities, etc. And he has this list of people who he doesn't quote unquote trust, so to speak. So in June of 1972, 5 former employees of Richard Nixon, of his reelection campaign, break into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C. That's why it's called Watergate. And then they get arrested. To this day, no one knows what they were looking for, and it actually doesn't really become too big of a deal until the trial in 1973, when the judge wanted to find out who was responsible for all of this. And a pair of Washington Post journalists began publishing stories that say that it was people close to the president who ordered it, and then they tried to cover it up. Who are these famous journalists, you ask? Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Woodward and Bernstein, very, very famous journalists. So further investigation into the Watergate showed that Nixon was taping conversations in his office. He was wiretapping other people in the White House, breaking into people's places and sabotaging his enemies. Now, by mid-1974, no one really knows whether he was involved, and it's still not known, but he's in hot water. But it is obvious that by mid-1974, he at least was involved in covering it up by authorizing payments of people to remain silent or to perjure themselves when asked if President Nixon was helping cover it up. There's no proof that he asked for it. There's no proof that he was involved in the break-in of the 1972 apartment, but they did figure out that he was at least helping and covering it up and paying people to perjure themselves. So in 1974, a House Judiciary Committee said he should be impeached. So instead of being impeached, he resigns and he becomes the first president in history to resign. And so what his legacy is that we have today is this idea of abuse of government power. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, also had to resign because he took bribes while he was the governor of Maryland. Many want him to go to jail for Watergate, but he remained adamant about his innocence. So after Nixon resigns, Frank Church, a senator from Idaho, led a committee showing the abuse of power of the government since the beginning of the Cold War. Frank Church finds out that the FBI had been spying on Americans since the beginning, hurting the civil rights movement, overthrowing governments, and the CIA was overthrowing governments and assassinating leaders throughout South America. And so what happens at the fall of with the fall of Nixon is we get the passing of the Freedom of Information Act, which meant letting scholars, journalists, and ordinary citizens access to government papers. So the idea, and this is a very, the idea is that no matter whether he was involved personally or not is not the issue. The issue is that he did help cover it up, and that there had been a legacy of abuses, not only by him, but by the U.S. government since the beginning of the Cold War. And this makes people mad. And so Nixon is kind of the man who takes the brunt of it. And this is a very famous picture of him, and he had an interviewer by the name of, I believe it was Robert Frost, David Frost, excuse me, who interviewed him. And this is when he had, there's a really good movie by called Frost Nixon about this. And this is when he makes the famous quote about, the guy keeps grilling him about Watergate, and then finally he asked him if it was, Frost asked Nixon if it was illegal, and Nixon gets mad at him and says, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal, right? Saying the president is above the law. And this is really kind of the end of Richard Nixon and why his legacy is what it is today. Now, this is kind of what people think of as the end of the golden age for America. Remember, we talked about the affluent society and how everybody thought everything was going great in the 50s and 60s. Well, things by the early 1970s are starting to go a little bit sideways economically. And this, what happens is this convinces many Americans of what conservatives feared the most, and that was government intrusion into their daily lives. You also get slow growth and inflation. And you get the beginning of outsourcing. And so and also the dollar is so strong that it's hard to sell overseas. So because everything that comes from America is worth so much more than everywhere else, that it's hard for people to import things from America because they cost too much. So in 1971, the U.S. gets a trade deficit for the first time in history. This is when President Nixon also takes the dollar off of the gold standard, and henceforth all currencies will be based on each other through markets. And all of this was in the hope of lowering the dollar value to be able to make goods cheaper, because now we're importing more than we're exporting. This is what's called stagflation, when we have slow growth and inflation. And it also happens because in 1973, there's a brief war between Israel and Egypt and Syria and the Middle East. And since the United States backs Israel, the Middle East retaliates by quadrupling the price of oil and suspending export of oil to the U.S. for several months. This is what is called the 1973 Mideast oil crisis. We have a shortage of gas and oil. There's lines at gas stations. Most of them ran out of fuel or were quite limited. And this really sends a shock to our economy, and it takes the United States a long time to get out of this economic hole that's created by this. Ask your parents or your grandparents if they remember the 1973 oil crisis. And this really rips the world economy. There's stagnant economic growth and high inflation throughout the world from 1973 all the way to 1981. In the United States, for example, inflation was up 10% a year for those 8 years, but growth was only 2.4%. And so what this also does is it means that people begin dumping their huge cars for more efficient Japanese cars, right? This is kind of the beginning of this decline of the United States as an automobile force as well. So what goes along with this is the social compact between the government and society and the citizens was declining, deteriorating. By 1980, Detroit and Chicago had lost more than half of their manufacturing jobs. The low-wage states of the Sun Belt began to have increasing influence. Unions get weaker as jobs shift from manufacturing to service employment. Um, and this does affect people because between 1953 to 1973, the median family income had doubled, right? And from 1973 to 1993, real wages did not increase, right? So the 1970s and the 1930s were the two decades in US history where people were poorer at the end of the decade than the beginning. Okay. Meanwhile, what also happens is since you don't have Nixon anymore, Gerald Ford becomes president. Um, and he never had much of a chance. Uh, the first thing he does was to pardon Nixon from prosecution. And the whole reason for that is he just wanted to put the scandal behind them because they wanted to move past it. And they thought, and Ford thought, well, if we keep having these trials and Nixon keeps going up and we keep talking about him in public life, then it'll never go away. But this was widely unpopular. Um, Ford lacks significant accomplishments. He urges people to shop wisely, to reduce their expenditures, just to be a little more frugal. And although during his time period inflation dropped, unemployment went up, and in 1974, 1975, um, unemployment was at 9%, which was the highest it had been since the Great Depression. Internationally, Ford did sign in 1975 an accord with the USSR, making sure that the USSR respected European boundaries and that they wouldn't move further into Western Europe. Um, and they also signed the accord that what went with this is the basic idea of human rights and human liberties and things like that. And these will become known as the Helsinki Accords, which are fairly popular today. And these accords will actually start many democratic movements in Eastern Europe that are under the Soviet bloc because the Soviets are starting to have, are starting to sign agreements that basically are telling them that are saying that they will give people certain rights. I forgot to mention this picture is there were actually two assassination attempts on Henry Ford, excuse me, Gerald Ford's life, both in 1975 and both in California. The first was an attempt to kill Ford in Sacramento. Then 17 days later, a woman tried to assassinate him in San Francisco. And I believe this is the picture from San Francisco in early October of 1975.